Okay, we can go ahead and get started, I think. Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's roundtable discussion on electronics waste. My name is Zoe Herm. I'm a graduate student in the College of Chemistry here at Berkeley and a member of the executive team of the Berkeley Energy and Resources Collaborative, or BERC. The mission of BERC is to connect, engage, and educate. And I think that by being here today, we're all accomplishing all of those goals. We're educating in terms of this room has all levels of understanding of the issue of electronics waste, from a completely introductory level of knowledge to some of the world's leading experts on electronics waste. By the end of today, we will have seen an introductory keynote discussion about electronics waste, and we will have witnessed high-level, forward-thinking conversation about e-waste from some of these experts. In terms of connect, this audience is almost exactly half students and half professionals. So I hope that we'll all be able to take advantage of that opportunity to discuss with each other, both during the panel discussions and during some of the networking receptions that we have planned. In terms of engaging, I think that this event presents opportunities for all levels of engagement, from augmenting our own personal global citizenship in terms of our own personal electronic devices, to even maybe some of the students who are in the audience today might find themselves working in the electronics waste arena who might not have otherwise. Most importantly, we're fulfilling the mission of BERC, but we're also learning from the great knowledge that the panelists have chosen to come here and share with us today. Their knowledge and their expertise and what they've dedicated their careers to is something that it's a great privilege to be able to hear them discuss with each other and to be able to be inspired by their excitement for having this high-level conversation with each other. I'd like to simultaneously thank and introduce Professor Alastair Iles, who will be giving our keynote introduction about electronics waste from the lens of green chemistry. Professor Iles is an assistant professor of environmental policy in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. He is a doctorate in environmental policy and law from Harvard. He is the law and policy director at the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry, a co-sponsor of today's event. And his research focuses on policies for green chemistry, environmental health and chemicals, the environment, and social impacts of biofuels and sustainable fuel systems. So without further ado, I'd like to thank Professor Iles and welcome him up to give the keynote. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Fran Nap, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. Professor Alastair Iles is non-hearing, so I'm here to speak on his behalf. I'm going to read his talk to you. And if you wish to ask any questions afterwards, I can type that really quickly for him, and he'll write it out, and I can communicate that to you. So when I say my and I, it's actually Alastair speaking. Let's see, electronic waste, trends, and green chemistry. We all know what's happening in e-waste recycling areas in China, India, and Africa. We also know that recycling and policy are lagging in the US, and that electronics companies could do far more to address the problems in their supply chains. E-waste cannot be treated just as a domestic issue. It is also a very complicated global issue. Nonetheless, some significant progress has been made, and we can all learn from this. I will introduce a few key points to help frame the Roundtable's work today, and then focus obsessively on the use of green chemistry as a preventative approach. Just briefly, green chemistry is the design of molecules and chemical processes to reduce or eliminate toxics, use more renewable materials, and generally use resources more sustainably. My talk will set the stage for what will hopefully be a fruitful afternoon of conversation about actions to continue tackling e-waste problems. First, e-waste problems are continuing to expand in magnitude and reach across the world. It has been almost a decade since the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition and the Basel Action Network released their first findings on Guayou in China. According to recent reports out of China, little has changed there. The Chinese government is still not enforcing its e-waste laws effectively, and there is still little formal recycling infrastructure. There is now rapid growth in e-waste trade between developing countries, not just between developed and developing countries. E-waste generation is also happening as a result of the rapid growth in domestic electronics consumption in many developing countries. China and India are quickly turning into intensive consumers, at least in the more affluent classes. The Chinese government estimates that China produced 3.5 million tons of e-waste in 2011, second only to the US. Other regions of the world, notably in Africa and India, are emerging as sites for e-waste dumping and recycling because of the nature of the global economy. Differences in labor costs between developed and developing countries, the lack of domestic regulation over imports and exports, and specialization in e-waste recycling intersect to help encourage vibrant, quote-unquote, trade in e-wastes. Just a few days ago, the Basel Convention Secretariat's EWaste Africa project released a new report on trends in Africa. The report concludes that up to 1 million tons of e-waste was generated and recycled in Benin, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Nigeria in 2010, with all the usual labor conditions. Second, there are significant environmental and human health problems emerging wherever e-waste recycling and dumping are taking place on a large scale. Increasing information is available on this now. I want to highlight a few examples of recent scientific studies from China, which is now the leading source of public health data on this topic. Tens of studies by Chinese researchers are now available. They suggest that e-waste processing contaminates workers, residents, communities, and ecosystems on a pervasive, if localized, scale. For example, tests of soils and dust found on roads, in schoolyards, and in neighborhoods consistently find that lead, mercury, copper, and dioxins are present at elevated rates. Other studies show that contaminants are prevalent in the air in those areas. Studies show that there are much higher levels of PBBs, PBDEs, and PCBs, and for those who don't know, polybrominated biphenyls, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, and polychlorinated biphenyls. PBDs are a class of flame retardants, and the others are also used in electronics in various ways. In the hair, these are found in the hair of residents living in e-waste recycling towns compared to residents living in other towns. Tests of children's blood for lead and cadmium also demonstrate significantly higher rates. PBDEs and PCBs are found in chicken, eggs, and other foods. Heavy metals are also found in local rice. Thus, communities are being exposed through diet, air, water, and soils. The cumulative exposures must be very large. Wildlife are highly likely to share these body burdens. In other words, our suspicions that local populations are being exposed are being confirmed. One thing to keep in mind is that most of these studies simply indicate that children, workers, and residents are being exposed now. They do not indicate what health consequences, if any, may result in the longer term. Nonetheless, based on studying industrial pollution elsewhere, we can expect that there will be increased rates of cancer, developmental problems, cognitive deficits, and reproductive harms. A very few studies are now revealing that health effects are happening. For example, in 2011, researchers exposed human lung cells to the air typically found in Taizhou and discovered signs of inflammation and oxidative stress responses, which are often precursors to cancer and cardiovascular diseases. Also in 2011, scientists concluded that higher blood lead levels in women in Guayou were associated with significantly higher adverse birth outcomes, like stillbirth, lower birth weights, and lower APGAR scores. We can expect similar human health problems in other major e-waste processing hubs. This should motivate further government interventions and voluntary company actions to prevent the problems from worsening. Green chemistry could do much to help prevent these hazards from happening in the future, namely removing the toxics from electronics in the first place, rather than trying to control exposures. Third, there are ongoing challenges in regulating and making policies for e-waste as a problem that crosses many national borders. While regulatory reforms have occurred in Europe, the US, and Asia, many gaps persist. In the US, while many take-back laws are showing up at the state level, partly due to the work of some in this audience, the federal government still has not set a national standard binding all manufacturers and recyclers in the country. The Responsible Electronics Recycling Bill was introduced into Congress last summer and has many sponsors as well as recycling industry support. But the current environmental mood of Congress seems to be scowling. The California Take-Back Law has its blind spots, since it is still possible to export e-waste from California because it is the federal government that has legislative power to impose export controls. In turn, China has had e-waste laws dating back to 1996, and a customs directive prohibiting imports since 2000. A fairly new law requires that e-waste processors must comply with pollution standards and that e-waste not completely recycled must not be sent to businesses without recycling capabilities. Yet these laws are haphazardly implemented, not surprisingly because of the country's complex governing politics. Even in Europe, with its world-leading take-back regulation, there appears to be some significant leakage as recycling businesses still prosper from illegally sending their electronics to developing countries. The Basel Convention report on Africa found that most of the e-waste imports originated from Britain, France, and Germany. The issue of electronics donations to developing countries remains a vexed one. It is sometimes difficult to distinguish between computers that can be reused and those that are being shipped under pretenses. The Basel report also found that 30% of the imports into Ghana were non-functional. Again, it is better to limit the fallibility of regulation and import-export controls as much as possible by using green chemistry in designing and making electronics. Importantly, the Basel ban is finally set to enter force after many years of stagnation. In October last year, the Basel Convention Conference of Parties made a deal to allow the Basel ban to proceed alongside a new scheme for those countries wanting to continue trading, but under adequate social and labor conditions. This international rule aims to prevent toxic wastes from being shipped from OECD, or Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to non-OECD countries. The rule will likely affect the global trade in e-waste. However, the U.S. is still not party to the treaty, limiting its relevance for this country. The ban will be a positive step, but will take time to implement, and there will inevitably be non-compliance and porosity in barriers. As well, the new regime that allows developing countries to continue trading in hazardous wastes is still ill-defined, and it remains to be seen whether the health and labor safeguards will actually be implemented. I will turn to some possible solutions. Increased recycling and take-back is an important part of the solution. If we can increase recycling rates in the U.S. and assure that e-waste is indeed properly processed, this would help greatly. This seems less likely given the power of global economic patterns in encouraging trade with developing countries. United Nations Environmental Program is now promoting the creation of formal, centralized, large-scale recycling centers as an alternative to informal networks in developing countries. If imposed from the top down, these centers may unfairly displace the informal sector, throwing many workers out of jobs even if they have poorly paid and unhealthy conditions. We need to find ways to improve existing recycling networks. Using green chemistry in designing electronics is another important part. Green chemistry promotes the creation of materials that are benign by design, that is, safer at every stage of a product's life cycle, from its chemical composition to its method of disposal. In contrast to the reductionist approach of considering problematical chemicals one by one, green chemistry considers the basis of molecular design in an ecological and human health context of the product life cycle. For example, automotive paints are based on toxic solvents. Increasingly, paint makers are using water-based paints to eliminate the volatile organic compounds released when painting. The electronics industry has begun looking into green chemistry over the past decade, but could do much more to develop innovative designs. Much of the motivation for using green chemistry has come from regulatory pressures in Europe, notably RoHS, the Restriction of Hazardous Substances Directive, that require the phase-out of substances. Manufacturers have thus worked to redesign their materials to some extent. We have all heard about the efforts of companies to find lead-free solder, alternatives to flame retardants and plastic components, remove mercury from flat screens, and reduce the use of bromine and chlorine compounds in products generally. This is only a starting point. Some manufacturers, particularly Hewlett-Packard, are seeking to go further. Recently, my green chemistry ethics seminar heard from Helen Holder, HP's corporate materials selection manager, about what the company is doing. HP is developing an electronics materials assay using the green screen that the Clean Production Action NGO developed to rank substances, as well as many other data sources. HP knows that it is expensive to keep switching between materials, so it has an incentive to find the safest possible materials that are unlikely to be regulated in the long term. The company knows that it can't control exposures in recycling sites in developing countries. In general, green chemistry could help with reducing toxics and finding alternative materials to substitute for these toxics. There are relatively few alternative materials that could be used in electronics at this point. We need to generate and test many more materials. It could also help with developing materials that can be extracted more easily by recycling technologies. For example, the Finnish Agassi company won a European Green Chemistry Award for its technology to extract metals from electronics in more energy efficient ways. Implementing green chemistry may seem less direct as an approach because US companies may not have that much direct knowledge or control over how products are made overseas. However, companies based in the US can conduct R&D to develop green chemistry design ideas for use in manufacturing complexes in China, such as Foxconn's huge plants in Shenzhen and Chengdu. They can require their formulators and suppliers to use green chemistry methods and can provide special training to chemists and material engineers overseas. Some Chinese scientists and universities are already interested in green chemistry. This could be harnessed. Firms can also design electronics to last longer and to be more readily recycled without generating hazards. As we have just seen in the New York Times articles on Apple's lack of oversight over the treatment of workers making its products, many companies are deliberately neglecting their supply chains. There is still much room to expand the use of green chemistry throughout supply chains. In concluding, it is important to set standards for materials and designs that can influence manufacturing around the world, along with improving recycling rates and technologies. This will benefit not only consumers and governments in the US, but workers and communities in developing countries. More attention needs to be devoted to green chemistry. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Isles and Freya, for that wonderful introduction to electronics waste and how green chemistry can play a role in the beginning of life as opposed to the end of life, which is what we're going to start talking about now with our first panel. So we're going to start our first panel about policy drivers for electronics waste, and I'd like to introduce our moderator for both of our panels today, Tony Kingsbury. Tony splits his time between UC Berkeley and Dell. At the University of California, he leads our Sustainable Products and Solutions program, which is funded by the Dow Foundation. He also teaches courses on sustainability. At Dow, he leads Dow's global engagement with the Sustainability Consortium and co-directs Dow's Breakthrough to World Challenges 2015 Corporate Sustainability Goal. He's a recognized expert in global sustainability, environmentally preferred purchasing, life cycle thinking, plastics, and chemical and environmental issues, and public policy. I can say personally that I know dozens of students, as well as myself, whose Tony's expertise has touched and made our educational experience here at Berkeley so much greater than it ever would have been without him. So thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for moderating our discussions today. And I'd like to invite their next 5 panelists.
The rest of the panelists, please come on up.
Yeah, please come on. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe. Well, I'd like to thank Burke and Zoe and Andrew and the rest of the team for inviting us here today. As I was talking with Zoe about the panel and how we're going to do this, and she had originally said, well, we've got 9 or 10 panelists. Why don't we just have everybody up front and we'll just have a big free-for-all for a couple hours? And I said, maybe let's not. Why don't we split this up so that at least we can all fit on the stage? And so we've split the panel up into kind of a policy discussion and a market discussion. But since the two end up kind of mixing across, we've got a little mixing up that we've done in terms of the panelists. Also, because we've got a lot to talk about, I think, and I've got a lot of questions, and I'm sure you guys have some questions, right? You've got some questions. Think of questions as we go throughout the day. Write them down if somebody's talking so you can ask them later, because we do want to hear what you have to say and what questions you have. If not, I've got lots of questions here. But as we go throughout the rest of the afternoon, my intent is to have a conversation here, not amongst ourselves, but also with you, to find out what's going on and what you're thinking about. And I'm also not going to spend a lot of time introducing people. I think there's a slide that kind of shows up every once in a while that says where folks are. But also as a part of your introductory remarks, I kind of do a brief who you are and how do you fit into this whole topic of e-waste. I think to give context to each of the speakers. And so what I want to do is just do that, is to start the conversation this way and kind of work our way down, starting with Heidi, and we'll just work our way down the aisle here and have each of you kind of introduce yourselves in the context of who you are and how does this fit into e-waste, and if you've got a few other things that you want to say. And then we'll ask a few questions, and then we'll go to the audience that way. So with that, Heidi?
Thank you very much, Tony. My name is Heidi Sanborn. I'm the Executive Director of the California Product Stewardship Council. We are a nonprofit that formed 5 years ago here in California because the state kept doing what we call bans without plans. And they would impose disposal bans without any plan or any funding on what to do with the products. And electronics is one of those products that some of them are banned, but not all of them. And we think that really all of them have value and should be getting recycled. So we promote a producer responsibility approach, where the producers would be responsible for the life cycle of the product. And we think that has a couple of really important feedbacks to the manufacturer. When they have to actually start taking back their product and recycling it, and they realize where the cost points are, they very quickly think redesign. Right now, those costs are externalized onto the taxpayers and ratepayers who cannot afford it, so we don't end up with enough funding for recycling. But it doesn't send the economic feedback mechanism to the producer to change how they design. And one really good example we have is one manufacturer of computers here actually started voluntarily taking back their products, realized that most of the cost in recycling was because they had designed it, so it took 3 different screws to take the battery out. And they very quickly thought, that's very labor intensive. We should rethink this, and did a push-out, pop-out battery. Those are the kinds of simple design changes that would happen if we had a producer responsibility program. But we do have a great program in California in many ways. Maybe it could be improved on, and that's part of the discussion that I think we'll have today. So thank you very much for having me.
My name is Barbara Kyle. I'm the national coordinator for a nonprofit called the Electronics Take Back Coalition. So we're a coalition of NGOs who work on e-waste and electronics, sustainable electronics. A lot of the groups, that's not the only thing that they work on, but we are sort of an intersection where groups work together on that issue. And we do that with a number of different strategies. We work a lot on policy. We're involved with the advocates in many of the states that have passed or are passing take-back laws. We are also active in DC on the federal bill that Professor Isles mentioned before on export. We do some work where we publicly push the companies to do make voluntary improvements, and we do what some people call market campaigning or corporate campaigning to use PR and public pressure to encourage the companies to make improvements in what they're doing. We also have some of our groups focus on purchasing, marshaling the power of purchasers who are buying electronics to push for the companies to make improvements. If they listen to anything, they listen to their customers far more than what the regulators say. So that's a powerful way of trying to push this industry. And we have actually some folks from Center for Environmental Health that leads some of that work here in the room today. Another partner of ours, the Basel Action Network, works on a different strategic point, which is focusing on the recyclers and the recycling, promoting good recyclers and exposing the bad ones. And it's actually gotten to the point with so little regulation, they've developed a voluntary standard called e-stewards. And you'll hear more about that in the next panel because we have some e-stewards here. So We use a number of different strategies to try to push this industry while we have been the Electronics Take Back Coalition, with our initial focus on using take back both to get the recycling to happen, but also, as Heidi was mentioning, to influence design. But we're now also working even more directly on trying to promote better design from the beginning, because it really requires both of those things.
Great, thank you.
All right, I guess I'm next. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Agassi. I'm with the State of California Department of Toxic Substances Control, which is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency. And the department I work for traditionally is a hazardous waste regulatory agency for the state. And so around 10 years ago, we were asked the question specifically about cathode ray tubes, which are the older style TV tubes, which contains pounds of lead each. So we were asked whether or not they would be captured under the hazardous waste classification system we have in California, and we looked at some data and determined that yes, they were. So essentially, immediately that kind of created a crunch or a problem for properly managing unwanted electronic devices, or EWaste, which was, hazardous waste is very sort of heavily regulated, and transferring it, storing it, accepting it, processing it, all of those types of activities are regulated typically under a hazardous waste facility permit, which just makes it sort of an impractical thing. So what we did at that time was, one, sort of acknowledge that yes, indeed, cathode ray tube devices are hazardous waste in California, and unlike other states, we don't exclude household waste from that definition. So in I think virtually every other state, household waste is sort of carved out and excluded from being hazardous waste. So we acknowledge that, and then secondly, we got to work on some regulations to sort of align the regulatory requirements for people managing things like televisions and other sort of consumer-grade electronics, to make those requirements sort of protective, but not so as stringent as industrial waste requirements. So we have this system called universal waste, and we put them under that sort of regulatory scheme. So the outcome of these sort of events was that landfills were sort of on notice that electronic waste, specifically cathode ray devices, but other things which we subsequently tested by the hazardous waste protocols, we're testing hazardous waste, which meant no landfilling. So that's sort of where Heidi's referring to, a ban without a plan.
That's why we formed.
We didn't sort of set out to say, you shall not dispose of electronic waste. What we really did was we determined that actually electronic waste kind of always sort of was captured. If we actually looked into it, if we had analyzed electronic waste, we would have found that in many cases these things have levels of lead and other hazardous waste constituents that would make them hazardous waste. So subsequently, our legislature acted, and there were two bills, one introduced in 2003 and another in 2004, which set up a program to fund the collection and recycling of certain types of electronic devices. And that's sort of an arcane topic I can get into more, but the bulk of the things that have been going through that program since its inception have been CRT devices, so monitors, televisions, and other things with picture tubes. And the funding, we don't like to call it an advanced recycling fee. I wrote over here with Jeff Huntz, my colleague from CalRecycle, who his department and mine sort of share responsibility for implementing this program in California. The fee is on new devices, funding the management of legacy devices. They're really not the same devices. So we've had this program in place for we're entering year 8. We've had something like 1.2 plus billion pounds of covered electronic devices go through the system. These devices have been processed sort of in California, and their commodities separated. So the result of that has been that, at least for the covered devices, the exportation of whole intact devices from California has really sort of turned around, and we think virtually all of the devices that are in this payment program, Electronic Waste Recycling Act, are processed in-state, and if export happens, it's of the commodities derived from those devices. So I could go on and on. That's sort of just an introduction to where I'm coming from.
Hi, my name is Dustin Mulvaney. I'm an assistant professor of sustainable energy resources at San Jose State University. I'm also a research scientist with the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. And the expertise that I bring here today deals with end-of-life photovoltaic technologies. So when we talk about e-waste, we have to keep in mind that there is another semiconductor technology that's much bigger and weighs a lot more. But there are some things that I would point out are very different about PV versus e-waste. This is just a model developed by Basel from Brookhaven National Lab showing you kind of a profile of e-waste, a PV waste generation at a particular manufacturing facility. Oops, if you can go back to that slide. Oh, there we go. So you can see so what you got there on the x-axis is the year, right, moving from the startup of a facility into the future, and then the amount of waste generated. So you can see typically when a photovoltaic manufacturer starts up, they get a spike in terms of waste generation at the facility as they figure out how to manufacture their product better. Then their production levels in terms of waste go down a little bit. And in this case here, production is only running for about 10 years at this particular facility. So what makes PV waste very different is the product is meant to last a very long time period. So by the time it comes to the point where these PV modules are coming off of rooftops, that company could have disappeared 15 or 20 years ago. So you could see that the waste comes far after the company has manufactured the products. This creates a bunch of different obstacles for planning ahead and having extended producer responsibility in the PV industry. Not to mention that the industry dynamics are very different. Apple Computer being the most valuable company in the world, and the solar industry living on very thin margins nowadays, particularly with the debate going on with China. On the next slide, you can kind of get a sense for, these are some numbers I developed for the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. Oops, the bottom got cut off, but don't worry about it. Basically, the point here is that most of the PV waste being generated today is coming from the manufacturing line. Basically, not many end-of-life modules are coming back today. But if we assume that modules are warranted from 20 to 25 years, we can start to expect what I've drawn here, which is a pretty significant tidal wave of PV waste. So by the far x-axis there is 2030. So these are by, which one is, 2040 now. Can you go back one slide real quick? So you could see, so that slide, there you go. So by 2030, and these are PV modules that were probably installed 5 or 6 years ago, we might be up over 200,000, close to 300,000 tons of PV waste. And then go into the next slide. And PV modules that were installed today, we expect to start coming off of rooftops by 2040. So this is upwards of 2 million tons of PV waste entering our waste stream. So this is going to be a significant management issue moving forward. And to the last slide, I would just point out, so PV modules have the perfect cocktail for e-waste because they have very toxic metals bound to very precious, rare, or otherwise valuable materials. So there's lots of materials that can be recovered, everything from the glass to the semiconductor materials. So for example, a very popular thin film technology called cadmium telluride has tellurium. Tellurium is about 1,000 times rarer than rare earths. So that creates a significant scarcity issue moving forward. Indium would be another material, tin. So there are lots of analogies we might draw between PV and e-waste, but there are lots of differences. So hopefully I can help clarify what some of those differences are as we talk today. So thank you.
Great. Fran.
My name is Fran Veluzzo. I with Dell Computers. I am not an environmental scientist or an expert on minerals or materials, but I do get involved very much in the policy end of electronic waste. Essentially, I'm in government affairs, so I work in many states with regard to legislation. Dell has been a real leader in this area. We have partnerships with Goodwill Industries, providing for approximately 2,600 collection sites around the country that Goodwill runs. Will collect electronic waste that we will pay them for and send to our recyclers for processing. And by the way, the Goodwill sites will collect all brands, not just Dell brands. We also have a partnership with Staples stores. About 1,500 Staples stores in the country will also will also receive Dell products for recycling at no cost to the consumer. And lastly, we have a partnership with the Christina Foundation, which provides refurbished computers to those who can't afford them, providing the donator of such computers with tax deduction as well as a discount on computer products. So these are the ways we created sort of a network to manage the end-of-life process for our products. My role here today is really to talk a little bit about Dell's direction, because we've changed our direction somewhat in the last couple of years. Dell was one of the industry leaders early on looking for a producer responsibility model. We came to believe that was the better model for our industry, because we know we can set up programs and run them more cost effectively than a government-run program, so we were very much interested in doing that, taking on those costs, but doing it in a much more cost-effective way. We advocated for legislation with that in mind. The bills that we pushed for provided for responsibility for the brand, required branding so that the individual consumer knew who was responsible, and also required submitting the total volumes in a report to the state every year. That program didn't quite